my question is, when you were saying yes to sex and rock and roll, were you thinking thoughts? Was this a kind of conscious rebellion to the established order, or was it just a purely gratification?
No, it was sort of the background music, if you like, to it all. I mean, I remember Sgt. Pepper very well in '67, for example, and it was part of the, as were very, particularly for me at any rate, the early songs of Bob Dylan, part of the background music to it all, part of the theme or mood to the decade, without question, yes.
So it was mood. It was gratification, it was pleasure, it was a big party. You weren't actually thinking ideological thoughts.
I don't think I quite said that, no. I don't think if your background music is Bob Dylan singing The Lonely Death of Hattie Carroll, that's not hedonism. The Indonesian dictatorship thought it would be better if Indonesia occupied and annexed the people and territory of East Timor. So they evolved a plan whereby they took the land and they subjected the people to a campaign of genocide. But what isn't as widely known as it could be or should be is that on the day they took that decision, Henry Kissinger was sitting in the room with the Indonesian General Staff.
With this woman, that can't be said. She's always thinking first about herself, second about her husband. That's never changed, and it's never going to. So he won't have...
That's your opinion,
nor will anyone... Well, guess what? Guess who's saying it? That's a very clever thing to say. Shall I ask, would you prefer I uttered your opinion? What a fatuous remark.
Christopher.
Are you ready to have Wahhabi preachers in the U.S. Armed Forces? You better get ready for it, unless you're going to take the James Madison view that there shouldn't be any chaplains in the U.S. Armed Forces to begin with, or in the prison system. People want to pray, you can't stop them. But we cannot have state-subsidized prayer. We cannot have state-subsidized preachers or chaplains. Give it up, or give it to your deadliest enemy and pay for the rope that will choke you.
She wasn't content just to say religious people volunteer for charities, if that was news to anybody. But she had to couple it with a smear against Fabianism and social democracy. Now, as a matter of fact...
Well, they weren't there, Christopher. That's all I was saying.
I'm so sorry to say that without the efforts of Fabianism...
But you're good at smears.
The efforts of Fabianism...
What's wrong with the smear?
I don't... I'll get to the end of this sentence if it kills you.
You've done what you're talking about. You shouldn't be in these gardens now. You denigrate Diana and her image.
I shouldn't be in these gardens. Who the hell are you? You look, I think you're about as smart as you look. You're about as smart as you look. I shouldn't be in these gardens. What? You see what brain rot? You see what brain rot descends on people? So I still am a Marxist, but I'm no longer a socialist. Some of you Talmudists will get this, I think. It takes a lot to make me cry.
Hitchens is a big topic and one that's going to hit a lot of nerves, probably.
Yeah. So what's interesting to me, and I have a perspective on this, you probably have a similar perspective on it, which is, we're a literary project in some respect. And a lot of the people we have discussed, even if they haven't written, per se novels, have had their work treated as a piece of literary artifact in some way, shape, or form. I feel that most of the people that we engage with on a day-to-day basis probably don't see Christopher that way, but from my perspective, I primarily see him that way. Do you have any, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, are we making an exception to the rule for him, or are people just missing the point of interpreting him?
I think that's part of the missing the point of interpreting him. I think there's two things that cause a lot of confusion in regards to Hitchens. One is his support of the Iraq War. Mm-hmm. And and his support of the Bush administration in that war.
Mm-hmm.
2 is his linkage with the quote-unquote Four Horsemen, including Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and himself. And a lot of people see him as actually the biggest firebrand of the four of them. And I find that a little ridiculous, actually.
Yeah, completely. This does tie to the question at hand, because if you think about the perspectives that the Four Horsemen apply, even though they're all writing, you have Dawkins and Dennett respectively arguing their point nominally from the point of a scientific evolutionary biologist and a cognitive philosopher. Sam Harris a little bit on sociology, history, depending on how you want to interpret it. People, I don't know what they think of what Christopher's perspective is, but he always said it was from a little bit of philosophy, but mostly from literature and the literary way of thinking, and how religion, in his mind, did or did not sort of go in line with that. I think that's a bit that is missing from people's assessment. And then if they appreciated that, they would know when they listen to Hitchens compared to the other guys they tend to collect him with. You're right, he is in many respects more moderate than them. He is on record even as saying that he would never... Well, first off, he says religion will never die, and then in a line people probably have never heard, he said, nor probably should it. That's a big difference between him and the men associated with him.
Christopher, just getting to the point of why religion still resonates, here's a quote from your book for you to reflect on. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world. It is the spirit of a spiritless situation.
This is the opiate of the people, quotation goes on. And it goes on even more beautifully to say that... no, it's not from me. It's not from me. It goes on to say that criticism of religion has plucked the flowers from the chain, not so that men and women may wear the chain without consolation, but so that they may break the chain and cull the living flower. It's from Karl Marx. It's the opening of his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. It's the most misrepresented quotation probably of the 19th century. It's the one where he doesn't say religion is the opium of the people.
But he does.
It's the one that shows that atheists are not dogmatists.
But he does understand, essentially, in making that point, why religion still resonates today.
He understands why religion is ineradicable, why it's part of the human makeup and personality, and why it's the most interesting argument that we have, because it was our first attempt at philosophy, just as it was our first attempt at healthcare, cosmology, astronomy, and so on. It's the argument that never goes stale.
And I think that's a difference that sort of runs through sort of everything he did. In my mind also, I feel like the criticism of Hitchens on religion that I encounter, yes, it comes from the right sometimes, but I think the right tends to be a little bit more polite about it outside of a few extreme folks. I think the more aggressive attacks on Hitchens from religion, vis-a-vis religion, from what I've encountered, comes from people on the left who are pissed with him with the Iraq War position anyway, and it feels a little bit like they're allowing sour grapes to come in and link the two criticisms together. Like they're just generally angry with him, so they'll be angry with him, come hell or high water. And I think probably
to conflate his opinion, like they put things in his mouth. For example, that he believed in protecting Israel. Nope. He's actually was a dedicated anti-Zionist, which is something very few people bring up.
It's funny, one of the few times I actually met him in person, he was debating a pure Zionist from a Jewish newspaper on the University of Chicago campus, and was very aggressive against him, and that idea of pure sort of nationalistic Zionist feeling, of which, Hitchens, who fundamentally was an internationalist and in every way, shape, or form, and a cosmopolitan, thought that he had no use for that, and it was that was a thing. You're right, people tend to forget it. In a way, he courted it a little bit, because as he grew older, this notion of a Jewish identity, which he had from his mother's side, I get her in history, she came from Polish Jewish and German Jewish origin. He allowed to sort of come into a little bit of his personality, and he did have discomfort with anti-Semitism as he saw it, but that should never be interpreted as saying he was just a wholesale proponent of everything Israel did. I mean, I think all you had to do was read the books he wrote, not to mention the book he co-wrote and co-edited with Edward Said called Blaming the Victims in Defense of the Palestinians. I think that tells you everything you need to know.
Right. I mean, one of the interesting things about him is I sometimes wonder, honestly, if part of his turn towards the Jewish identity was not just a big screw off to his brother. But
so, in a way, that's interesting because it brings up one of my favorite books of his autobiography, which, just unfortunate based on his illness, wound up being well-timed. The move towards Jewish identity came in the aftermath of his mother committed suicide in the 70s in Greece, and his father died. His father being, the ultimate English Navy man. It's like everything you would sort of imagine of a kind of cliche English man of duty. He died in 1989, and it was around that time that his mother's mother, I think, let it slip that you're Jewish, right? And you're right. The two brothers took things differently. They both left Marxist socialism to varying degrees. His brother more extremely. Christopher definitely adopted the Jewish identity much more strongly than his brother did. And in fact, if you listen to his brother on this topic, Peter Hitchens thinks Christopher took it probably much farther than the case warranted. But you agree, that may be a part of it. And they did not have the best of relationships. I mean, I think they
didn't really have a relationship at all, as far as I know, to the end of his life.
Right.
Obviously, when they were younger, but and I'll be honest with you. Like, I actually think weirdly, because Peter Hitchens is such a conservative, but that Peter Hitchens was better on the war question than Hitchens, but Hitchens' logic wasn't entirely ill-founded.
No, I mean, and this will definitely be a topic we can go in very deeply, so I don't know how much justice I can do. I think you're right. Christopher's approach to the war, in many idealistic respects, was the position that you would imagine an international socialist would want to take on the question of Saddam, independent of the other contexts at play. What it sort of had a weakness in was thinking how successful the United States as a whole could fill that role which ordinarily an international socialist body or group of people would have accomplished. I think, and that does bring up some interesting developments, because I think in much of his core thinking post-1989, the United States, in his mind, was the body filling the role that ordinarily, as I said, in the past you would think of for an international socialist, a different, kind of entity would have done. And I don't mean the Soviet Union, I just simply mean a kind of mentality and group collective action against certain types of totalitarian thinking, oppressive thinking, backwards thinking, all that kind of thing. America did become a big thing for him, well, pretty much throughout his life post 1980, obviously, when he moved here. Part of his story is very much in parallel with a man arguably moving to the right. I think that's debatable, but it's a worthy proxy. That's one of it. But the other part of it, which sort of is all tied up into it, is a Brit becoming an American.
Right, whereas Peter Hitchens is definitely a Briton.
I mean, arguably a Briton in his mind, a Briton who remains a Briton despite his perceived fact that Britain no longer exists, and that's the ultimate conservative position.
Yeah, I mean, I like to sometimes think of Christopher Hitchens as T.S. Eliot's polar opposite.
So he'd be W.H. Auden in a way.
Yeah, in many ways. British, adopts an American identity. It's interesting that he kind of towed the line for a long time with a lot of the 50s mid-boomer intellectuals, the public intellectuals, which there aren't many. I mean, there's a really good book on this, on that decline, The Last Intellectuals by Russell Jacoby, which I'm probably going to be writing a review about for some political mag somewhere. But it kind of points out, with rare exception of a lot of the last generationers, there weren't many public intellectuals that came out of the boomers because of both suburbanization and academicization. But Hitchens is one of them. He's in the same class as somebody else we've already talked about, Susan Sontag and Joan Didion, and those people. Which means he wasn't necessarily sort of a literary gadfly. What was interesting about him, though, is he sort of kept with the far left for a long time, even after he'd abandoned his Trotskyism.
Right.
But a lot of people miss about them. He became a big advocate of interventionist foreign policy, actually probably around 1998.
Well, a little bit earlier, actually, and this is interesting you brought up Susan Sontag, because this gets complicated when you go to the Iraq War, is that I think, first off, this comes up, you can see the development come up in, I think, Hitchens' second collection of essays called For the Sake of Argument, which I think is from the late 80s to the mid-90s, and yes, for the first Iraq War, he's very skeptical of it, but, in the aftermath of seeing what the Kurds went through, and then seeing the fall of the Soviet Union, and then the situation in Yugoslavia, he does become more interventionist, but at the same time, so did Susan Sontag. Christopher Hitchens and Susan Sontag were very adamant that Bill Clinton had better do something about the situation in the Balkans, because sadly the Europeans can't handle their own shit, nor do they want to. They were both very strong on that point, and Christopher kept up with it, and Susan certainly, if you ever see her positions on the Iraq War, certainly didn't share the same interventionist attitude that Hitchens had. But it's an interesting topic nonetheless.
To me, it was interesting because this is going to sound, I've sung Susan Sontag's praises in some ways and also been pretty harsh on her in others, but one of the things about her is she more thoroughly shared the biases of kind of a New York, Chicago intellectual class. And while she was harsh against the Democrats sometimes, in the main, like when the Democrats were intervening, it was good, and when the Republicans were intervening, it was bad. Hitchens was much more consistent, and sadly, that, in my personal opinion, that was actually pretty bad for him as far as, like, not just in the whole, bad for his career, but I do think he made some really bad calls. And some calls that just overshadowed a lot of his other criticism. One of the things people miss about him, though, is he didn't, even before he, quote-unquote, turned right, he didn't really tolerate bullshit from the liberal left or the far left. I mean, he took on Kissinger. Okay, fine, right? Mm-hmm. He took on Mother Teresa. That's harder for most liberals to justify, but still a conservative Catholic. But he took on Princess Diana and Bill Clinton too.
Right. And
at a time when the moderate left, even some of the far left, were still trying to be namsy-pamsy about that. Hitchens also never could decide if he was a neoconservative or a Marxist or both.
My favorite line on that Christopher had, I think I told you it before, but it's worth repeating. He said, it was, I consider myself a Marxist, but no longer a socialist. Jewish Talmudic scholars will get this. And I think it's true. He kept the Marxist thinking, the historical analysis, the sociological analysis. He just no longer thought that socialism would provide the solution to it. Maybe that makes him an ultra-leftist in some regards, I don't know.
Do you still consider yourself a leftist?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah, I do.
Because as you know, many of your critics will say what's happened to you is that, as your waistband expanded, your politics moved further to the right.
Well, they should see my waistband now. I've just lost 30 pounds. Not
you know
in,
what I
the,
mean?
not
I mean,
in
you
the
want-
nicest possible way. Alex.
But the accusation
No, of
against
course.
you is...
Well, it's such a well-known script
Yeah.
that it is indeed
Yeah.
deserving of the name cliché, and I pin that
Sure.
accusation on my accusers. That's what they're resorting to.
So do any of these labels apply to you, leftist or whatever? I mean, you're more of an iconoclast, aren't you?
Well, there isn't a global international working class movement anymore. There used to be. Some of us miss it like a missing limb, but it's gone. Is it likely to be replaced? I don't think so. Is there a socialist theory of an alternative world economy that, just in theory, could stand up against the idea of a market system, however defined? Not conspicuously, no. In fact, the anti-globalizing movement seems to me to be nostalgic for a pre-industrial society in many ways, thus to be rather conservative. From this, you could probably tell that I still think like a Marxist, which I do.
Yes. You believe in the dialectic.
Yes, and in the materialist conception of history. Yeah, I do that.
The end of the Cold War really buggered everything up, didn't it?
Yes, it did, but it was a huge release of human energy. Huge release of human energy and emancipation. It was a great day, November 9th, 1989. I have on my, just behind me, you can see it, a chunk of the Berlin Wall on my mantelpiece. And I was in Romania to see the end of the Ceausescu regime, the worst of them all. And it materializes my view that human nature is actually incompatible with dictatorship and slavery.
But you're right. He vacillated a lot on the neoconservative question, and ultimately I think the final position he had on it was, if you want to call me that, that's fine, I don't care.
Right, although he's profoundly different than all the other neoconservatives because of his stance on Israel, his stance on, well, you know, most of the neoconservatives are atheists, but their stance on religion was that it should be cynically used. You know, Leo Strauss talks about this a little bit. Right. And his disciples talk about it a lot. And you don't see that in Hitchens.
No. Yeah, exactly. And nor would he countenance it. But he would probably still refer to that as evidence to his position that, you know, you're dealing with fundamentally something which is a fraud, and you should be willing to interpret it that way. So maybe he does take a little bit of it, but definitely not the direction they're going. But I think you're also right to point out that he was no defender of sacred cows on the left. So obviously the Bill Clinton fiasco, it was funny about that one is that I think people have finally come around to his position on that, whether they know it or not, in preferring, to the extent to which they do, Obama over the Clintons. I think that is in some regard on the left wing a kind of manifestation of, yeah, he was probably right. Even if they never read his book, they probably reached a similar conclusion. But he also never countenanced the Kennedys either. He hated this myth of Camelot, in part because he hated myths in general, and anything that would sort of deify a particular person, despite their record, certainly was not going to be ignored by him. I remember one of my favorite articles of his near the end was around the time Eugene McCarthy died, and he was really adamant at saying, look, in the 68 people thought, oh, Bobby Kennedy, this liberal cause, he would have been the great president. No, Eugene McCarthy was the candidate who truly was progressive, and Bobby Kennedy, like all the Kennedys, fought dirty against him and accused him of being, you know, a left-wing sympathist. He was gonna negotiate with the North Vietnamese and all this kind of bullshit. I mean, you just have to look at the record to know what you're dealing with. I still think people don't fundamentally agree with him on that. I think Kennedy's still too deified on the left for people to think anything different. But that was no small thing. And, you know, the other thing about him, which, you know, definitely fueled his writing and his art as far as I'm concerned, is he knew, or at least was successful at using his hatred and his ire to fuel his writing more so than other people who, when they do it, tends to come across as perhaps either shrill or unpleasant or producing something on the paper which is just utter trash. He had a way of using it to fuel his style and his articulateness, which, as I said, I don't think he's really paralleled in that, except for maybe some of the old guys and gals of the Algonquin Round Table era.
Right. It is that, and it's hard for me not to have respect for him for those reasons, because for example, he was basically crowned Gore Vidal's heir, but had enough gall for pointing out that Gore Vidal, towards the end of his life, was becoming a crackpot. I mean, he wrote books. Was it progressively defending the Timothy McVeigh situation? I mean, like.
Oh yeah, he had and Christopher rightly phrased it this way. Vidal had the tone and temperament of the sort of America First crowd from the 1930s. In fact, I think Vidal may have been on record as sort of being sympathetic to your Charles Lindbergh types, saying, America out of all these wars, and why are we involved in this? Very not entirely progressive kind of attitude, yet still cloaked in it. But people were in just wanting to be against the Iraq War were just accepting any arguments that were reaching that conclusion, despite the fact that it's the journey and the thinking, which is 90% of what's important.
And Vidal, towards the end of his life, and people often don't realize this, in his military junta and Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, he makes a lot of good points about the war state, similar to maybe Eisenhower. Or you're right, the America First Society, which I don't necessarily even see as, a totally awful thing, but it is what it is. It's not a progressive position, quote unquote. That said, he started flirting within his writing like out and out 9/11 conspiracy theories.
Absolutely, yeah.
Chomsky called him out on this, and Hitchens caught on this, but Hitchens actually took heat for calling him out on that, what Chomsky didn't. And in many ways, Hitchens' career is of, a person who really couldn't get his full view articulated, and partly because of his literary way of writing and his ability to be hyperbolic. I mean, he was an anti-theist, right? But he also admitted that religion was probably necessary. He also didn't, pull punches. Like Sam Harris, for example, is notorious, basically in the End of Faith says that we should bomb Muslims for the possibility of their beliefs leading to actions. He pretty much says that explicitly. And Hitchens points out that Harris is hugely special pleading when it comes to things like there are no Buddhist terrorists. And Hitchens talks about a reporting mission he went to in Sri Lanka. And he was like, well, you're just wrong.
Well, he had that wonderful thing. It says,
does anyone ever listen to Dennis Prager's show? He's a slightly loopy Christian broadcaster, religious broadcaster, I should say. He's more Jewish than Christian, Judeo-Christian broadcaster, who quite often rather generously has me on his show. And he asked me a question the other day. He had a challenge of his own. He said, you're to imagine that you're in a town late at night where you've never been before and you have no friends and it's getting dark. And through the darkness you see coming towards you a group of men, let's say 10. Do you feel better or worse if you know that they're just coming from a prayer meeting? This is Mr. Prager's question to me. I said, well, Mr. Prager, without leaving you without quitting the letter B, I can tell you I've had that experience in Belfast, in Beirut, in Baghdad, in Bombay, in Bosnia, and in Bethlehem. And if you see anyone coming from a religious gathering in any of those places, you know exactly how fast you need to run. And no one has to explain to you why. And I haven't had to waste any time telling you, have I, ladies and gentlemen?
It was all, regardless of the religion, a point of threat. And you're right, he was not willing to, simplify things. And to a certain respect, and this is really good bringing back to the literary Hitchens, which I think is the piece, like you said, that people miss most easily. You got to think of the crowd that Hitchens was with pretty much throughout his entire life. Martin Amis, Ian McEwan, James Fenton, who is, I think, a poet, British poet, later on Salman Rushdie. You're dealing with someone who, in his world, and in the literature he enjoyed and wrote about, it was always dealing with literary-minded men, literary figures. They said of Hitchens that, they always wondered why he never wrote novels, but their theory was that, he was too, sort of kinetic, energetic, and wanted to be in the here and now in the society to have the time to sort of just sit and brood like novelists would. But, that literary spark has to come out somewhere, and I think it came out in his journalism. Now, perhaps people have grown accustomed to journalism perhaps being a little bit more simpler than Hitchens would tend to write, and I think Hitchens' fans, of which I am one, felt very comfortable with that. They, I think we tend to also be literary-minded people. We know how to read this. I have a feeling many of the people who read him and hated him didn't have or chose not to exercise the skills and the muscles that would allow them to read him. And yeah, that is a loss. And that does raise a bigger question that I think we're fond of raising. Was he writing at a time when people weren't prepared to read him the way that he wanted to be read in his writing? I don't know.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, a lot of the opposition to Hitchens is going to come from the Marxist left, and as a Marxist myself, in a way, although I'm a Marxist increasingly like Hitchens is, even though I don't agree with him on war, where I think, well, socialism isn't going to win the day anymore, at least not right now. I am increasingly of the opinion that there is a moral clarity in his writing that was completely undercut by nuance and thinking that people had a hard time dealing with. And I think that would be true in any age. I mean, no matter what, he'd be compared to, even if he stayed clearly on the left, he would be compared to Max Shachtman or Sidney Hook or, somebody that left-wingers used to respect and sort of hate now. That was inevitable. And by left-wingers, I mean like far-lefters. But the liberal left turning against him, too, is very much a moment of his time. And partly to do because he was very devoted, and I'm going to say honestly, both courageously and probably mistakenly, in defending, old ortho-liberal Enlightenment principles without caveat. And that's something that we're not in a time where anyone does that. I mean, if you look at, for example, belief in just like absolute free speech, you talk to even a Marxist above the age of 35, they're probably going to believe in it, right?
Yeah, I would agree. I would argue with that. I would agree with that. Sorry.
Right, unless they're like a hardcore Stalinist or something. Mm-hmm. But you talk to like anybody under the age of 30, and they're going to put all kinds of caveats on it. And there's study after study showing that right now. I mean, yourself obviously excluded. You might be 30 now. I don't know.
I'm not. I'm not yet 30.
but your cohort, right? Like I'm not being unfair.
Oh no. I'm more like the over 35. I'm pretty extreme in the opinion. Yeah.
Right, but that's actually sort of rare now.
Yeah.
The opinion amongst the U.S. young people is very close to, say, the opinion of British people in general. And Hitchens would have never had any of that.
Fire, 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 fire. Now you've heard it. Everyone knows the fatuous verdict of the greatly overpraised Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who asked for an actual example of when it would be proper to limit speech or define it as an action, gave that of shouting fire in a crowded theatre. It's very often forgotten what he was doing in that case was sending to prison a group of Yiddish-speaking socialists whose literature was printed in a language most Americans couldn't read, opposing President Wilson's participation in the First World War and the dragging of the United States into this sanguinary conflict, which the Yiddish-speaking socialists had fled from Russia to escape. In fact, it could be just as plausibly argued that the Yiddish-speaking socialists who were jailed by the excellent and overpraised Judge Oliver Wendell Holmes were the real firefighters, were the ones who were shouting fire when there really was fire in a very crowded theater indeed. And who is to decide? Well, keep that question, if you would, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, I hope I may say comrades and friends, before your minds. Are
I exempt myself from the Speaker's kind offer of protection that was so generously proffered at the opening of this evening. Anyone who wants to say anything abusive about or to me is quite free to do so, and welcome, in fact, at their own risk. But before they do that, they must have taken, as I'm sure we all should, a short refresher course in the classic texts on this matter, which are John Milton's Areopagitica being the great hill of Athens for discussion and free expression, Thomas Paine's Introduction to the Age of Reason, and I would say John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty, in which it is variously said, I'll be very daring and summarize all three of these great gentlemen of the great tradition of especially English liberty in one go. What they say is, it's not just the right of the person who speaks to be heard. It is the right of everyone in the audience to listen and to hear. And every time you silence somebody, you make yourself a prisoner of your own action because you deny yourself the right to hear something. In other words, your own right to hear and be exposed is as much involved in all these cases as is the right of the other to voice his or her view. Indeed, as John Stuart Mill said, if all in society were agreed on the truth and beauty and value of one proposition, all except one person, it would be most important. In fact, it would become even more important that that one heretic be heard, because we would still benefit from his perhaps outrageous or appalling view. If someone tells me that I've hurt their feelings, I say, well, I'm still waiting to hear what your point is. Right. I'm very depressed how in this country you can be told, that's offensive, as if those two words constitute an argument or a comment. Not to me, they don't. And I'm not running for anything, so I don't have to pretend to like people when I don't.
No. So in some way, he came at the wrong moment. Also, hitching his wagon to the Bush administration was probably a bad idea.
This is it's an interesting story because it just opens up so many things that were happening at a specific point in time, which didn't even start with the Bush administration. I mean,
nope.
Part of this narrative...
It started with the Clinton administration also.
Exactly. The first time leftists were ready to hang Christopher Hitchens is, during the Monica Lewinsky scandal, Sidney Blumenthal, who was... I forgot his exact position in the White House. It was some sort of public relations type role. I could be wrong, but I think that's what it was. During the investigation, Sidney Blumenthal, did say of how I think it was something to the effect of how he would try to either slander the women who were accusing Clinton of some imbroglio or what have you, or whatever activity you're doing to sort of keep it under control, as you would sort of expect in any administration, just trying to keep kind of things at a manageable level. And then I think Sidney said something else on the stand, which wasn't true, and Hitchens knew that he was lying, even though Sidney was a friend. So Hitchens decided, no, I have to, at this point, testify and say, no, you're basically lying to the commission, and he did. And a lot of people wanted Christopher's head for that. And they, accused, the whole idea of, ratting out your compatriots, came back in the a la, Elia Kazan. And this sort of story just keeps coming back on the left. The left arguably claims not to have, or to be skeptical of moral positions, yet one moral position which they always seem to express no matter when it happens is this: you don't rat on your friends, like Omerta or something.
I've always found that interesting. And you're familiar with the work of Jonathan Haidt, where he says that loyalty is not a big trait for liberals and leftists. And it's usually a tell for conservatives. I find that sort of laughable in real life because, not that Haidt's wrong about that, but that people don't understand themselves to report honestly. Because you and I have both been on left-wing groups. You know what happens if you're perceived as disloyal. Like,
very
it's
so.
Way nasty.
I mean, let's just say we saw it firsthand.
Yeah.
End of story.
And, we'll just leave it at that. So I find that fascinating, right? And Hitchens was not seen as loyal enough, and in another way was seen as loyal to an outmoded idea, which is sort of this dual contradictory accusation that he's a disloyal turncoat, and B, and he doesn't have principles, but B, he does have principles. They're just the wrong ones, and they're old. And and to some limited extent, I'm not even going to disagree, because as he got older, he more and more was interested. His book on Why Orwell Matters is really good in some ways, even though I think he's naive about some things about Orwell. But his book on Jefferson is good, but incredibly selective.
His book on Jefferson. I think the part of his book on Jefferson that feels the most of the time in which he wrote that book was the Jefferson's relationship with the Barbary States. Right. Which is interesting. In fact, it's a story I think that tends to be forgotten, but you could tell why he's choosing to discuss that topic versus another topic. And that brings up the topic I think you're sort of getting at, which is, the progression of someone who used to believe one thing and is trying to maintain continuity with that, even though he's sort of rejected a few things. If you think after '89, he's definitely sort of done with old socialist Marxism in some big way. I think we'd all admit that. And yet, what's going to fill the sort of open space there? And in the Jefferson book and in many other books, he would argue that the only revolution in his mind which still has merit to give people something to believe in is the American Revolution. And he really took it to heart. And that was the sort of replacement narrative for him in the aftermath of his positions with Marxism and socialism. And if you think about his position on the Iraq War, his positions on free speech, I think it all comes back to that point. And what to think about that. I think a lot of people who are with us still would maintain the position, it's outdated, that's just the delusions of white propertied men. And in some respects, they're partially right, but I will admit to being someone who says, no, there's a there that Christopher saw and wanted, and I would say there is more continuity in that thinking than people will give him credence for. I think he, again, like things being complicated and interesting, and Christopher Hitchens also being a fan of irony, this, I think, is important stuff to consider. I think you and I are probably more inclined to see the continuity than others, but there is, as we said, a little bit of discontinuity and complication. I just feel that, people don't fundamentally approach writers or thinkers in the context of which Hitchens was exercising his talents in a way that they would would have expected people to in literature, which is, someone you're going to encounter someone who's going to challenge you in some way on what you're thinking, and you have multiple responses to it. You can either just gut reaction say, this guy's disgusting, I'm not going to pay any credence to him, I'll paint him as an enemy, or, you know what, I don't agree with this guy, but let's see how this plays out, and what am I going to get from it. It was just, I feel like he was writing in an environment in which his opponents would never be receptive to thinking the way that he would have wanted people to think in general. I don't know. Although
it does leave, the paleo-conservative critique of him, and one that I actually think maybe isn't entirely false, is that he ended up being a Trotskyist for liberalism.
That's probably true.
Which isn't, and you're right, it's actually somewhat, if you think about your different interpretations of Marxism after Lenin, Trotskyism is the one that sees, liberal capitalism and that development as absolutely the most absolutely necessary. And so it's not even a huge leap in thought. I don't know if I think that's good or bad. I mean, because, for example, he was often criticized by his brother of never giving up the idea of permanent revolution.
And I think his brother was very astute on that fact. And remember, and the thing also, keep in mind for his brother also was a Trotskyist in his youth.
Yeah. His brother, yes, and in some ways, his brother is the anti-him. Their debate right before he died is actually pretty amazing. And it's amazing in that if you watch it, you end up, if you watch it and, you know, if you're a person of, I think, of conscious, you end up leaving and thinking like, man, those two men are smart and actually quite contrarian, both of them, but that they're weak. Each one of their weaknesses is the other one's strength, and each one of their strengths is the other one's weakness. You know,
combined, they would be one whole perfect person. I'm being facetious, but you know, yeah,
they would also be eternally at self-war. But yes.
Well, I mean, it's one of those that you could absolutely tell these men are brothers. It's like one of those. In order to have truly, you know, two entities that you consider polar opposites, there has to be a certain degree of continuity to allow you to highlight those polar opposite positions, and it's a thing to see. In fact, you know, I don't know if you're of the same position I'm at. You know, after Christopher Hitchens passed away, I found myself reading Peter Hitchens more and more, not just for the sake because I'm interested in what he's writing about, but also you could feel a little bit of that little, for lack of a better term, spark of Christopher Hitchens in the way Peter Hitchens writes. You maintain some sort of continuity, even though they have very opposite.
Literary contrarianism that they share, actually. I mean, even though if you hear Peter talk, he's way more measured and less bombastic, but he's just as snarky.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting if you think about Gen X public intellectuals, in so much that is such a thing. And
that's a good point.
Maybe an argument there isn't such a thing. Hitchens is actually not just a boomer, but he's in that gap, right?
He was born in 49, I think. Yeah.
Right, so he's a boomer, but he's of that, you know, like my parents were actually that last 5 years of boomerdom.
Yeah.
And so you see what comes after him. Who are the public intellectuals after him? And after this group we're talking about, because when we're talking about this generation of public intellectuals and maybe the people just right before them for a while, I think.
Oh, the one after, who's like a half step under him, Maureen Dowd. She's you know, people really like her, but she doesn't I feel like she lacks the elan and the verbal wit of Hitchens. I think her verbal wit is a little bit crasser and quicker. And
so you have Maureen Dowd, you have a lot of the feminist writers writing right now who are kind of public intellectuals, Roxane Gay and what's her name? She wrote Men Explain Things to Me. Rebecca Solnit and stuff like that. One thing I'll say about them, and this is going to come off as insulting, and frankly it kind of is, even though a lot of them actually do have good things to say, they are much more in line exactly with what the predominant party they're associated with wants. Almost to the point where you think you know where they're getting their money from, except when they get to write something personal that's political but doesn't touch on anything that would affect the vote. I think that's interesting, and I'm not saying that in like a super cynical these people suck way. I think it has more to do with how you could actually make a living as a public intellectual in the 70s and 80s and to some degree in the early 90s than after it. And the rejection of Hitchens, and also one of the things we need to like really focus in on, Hitchens got relegated to being a cranky commentator on religion.
Right, and exactly. That they made him a one-trick pony.
Right, and he played into that, frankly, I think because he needed money because he had cancer.
Near the end, I think his God is Not Great did make him. I mean, he was always he lived comfortably because he just continuously wrote and appeared on television. But he achieved financial independence with that book. But unfortunately, it was right at the time when things were ending
really
for
bad.
him. But yeah, you know, the thing you brought up about like him being relegated and his relationship to the younger generations, I think a good example of it, even though it skips Generation X, is if you go to Slate, which is where Hitchens was primarily for the last, what you would say, like 5 years, I should say. The guy right now writing there, who's pretty much the political commentator occupying the spot that Hitchens would have been, Jamal Bui, I forget how to pronounce it.
Right.
And if you really, he comments a lot on race and politics. Makes sense that he would, but if you really read him on politics in the context of who should be in power versus not, he's just like the Democratic Party establishment.
Why do you think that the left or liberals in America have not been more vocal in their criticism of Clinton?
Well, it's partly because of a theory and a practice that I've attacked elsewhere and implicitly attack again in this book, which is the theory of the lesser evil. In other words, right up front, a lot of people have given away their right to be critical, to be independent, or to be ethical. And of course, the consequences of that are a lot of slack is cut for crooks or very unscrupulous people like Clinton. I mean, for example, probably the thing that has the largest consensus behind it morally in the United States is that the campaign finance system is rotten to the core. Everybody knows that the way in which campaigns are financed and donations are solicited is absolutely unpardonable. But by any standard, including the standard of Richard Nixon, Mr. Clinton has taken the country to the cleaners. He's absolutely sold his party and high offices of state to foreign despots, to shady offshore corporations and so on, for large sums of illegal money. He's destroyed the distinction between hard and soft money, which is fairly hypocritical to begin with. He set a completely new standard for political corruption. Now, he's also attracted the least criticism from the usual suspects for doing so. Now, there's clearly something dysfunctional about that.
Jamal, how much of the Wall Street issue is a real problem for Hillary Clinton, or just one where she's not trusted, but it won't be a real obstacle?
So I go back and forth on this one because I think it's very awkward for her. I think it's a real problem in terms of trying to get these liberal voters to trust her as a nominee. I'm not sure how much in a general election it will matter, given the extent to which the Republicans will be doing quite well with Wall Street as well, and so it's sort of a wash. I think what is really challenging is that there is an answer for this, and it's just not one that Democrats want to hear, which is that Hillary Clinton and her husband were part of a movement of Democrats who are pulling the party to the center. And I think there's a way to make a defense of that, right? To say that, listen, we had 12 years of Republican presidents, we had to do something, and this is the thing that we did. But I don't know that anyone on the Clinton side wants to litigate all of this.
I make this case, say, in New York at some dinner party, and someone will look at me, I won't give a name, but someone, say, who might well be writing for the New York Review of Books, and will say, well, what do you want, Dan Quayle as president? And I say, look, is that really your argument? Is that the whole story? And they will, very often that's all it was, not even an argument. I mean, I do have a degree which involves passing a paper or two in formal logic. I don't need it for this purpose. That's not even an argument. It's not really even a very good observation. What it suggested to me, that people would lower their standards for reasoning in that way, was that there was something that might vulgarly be called denial at work, that they simply wouldn't face, that they had twice voted for.
Is that because...
And found charming, I might add.
Well, that's...
And, you know, it's like this is how far we've sunk. And I would argue that Slate has sort of sunk down to, or is approaching Salon levels at this point. Not just because of him.
Salon had the same trajectory. I mean, Salon in the late 90s, early 2000s was largely a literary venue, even more than Slate ever was, right? I mean, who wrote for, Salon could get like Jamaica Kincaid and stuff, and now it is literally a clickbait factory. And even that's dying. I mean, like, I see less and less Salon articles shared, and that's actually becoming true for Slate articles too, because people get tired of that. It works for a while. But you think of other public intellectuals like Tim Wise, okay? Mm-hmm. Anti-racism activist, public intellectual, writes a lot about white privilege. But then, like, when even alienating black activists, he supports Teach for America and called people who criticize Obama on his war policies racist. I mean, that's the amount that people obviously need political patronage to be a public intellectual now, because there's so many people writing.
Well, yeah, I mean, but isn't this the interesting byproduct, like we harp on so often, this is the result of having so much options available to you, right? Theoretically, the internet has opened up the possibility of reading so many different writers, having so many different perspectives, and yet, again, what seems to have happened is fragmentation as opposed to a plethora of intelligence. You know, you have to get very narrow and specific, or toe a certain kind of line.
I was going to say, it's fragmentation, but it's fragmentation actually that is really centralizing, because to get readers, you need some kind of something that can do it for you. There's no commercial apparatus right now that can. You know what can? Playing into fairly simple tropes. Now, this is fascinating to me because Hitchens bucked this trend, but I think he was one of, weirdly, he's one of the last of that generation. Yeah, Chomsky's still alive.
But here's the interesting thing, though. I mean, like, I hear of Chomsky more than I have a chance to read him. I'm sure he's published, but I mean, if you really think about it, maybe it's me not looking for it, but I just don't see him as forward and center as I do other things, or as I probably would have seen him forward and center 10 years ago. 15 years ago.
or even 5 years ago. I mean, when I was like 21, he was everywhere. Even then, though, he wasn't really writing much stuff. He was just giving interviews, and they were being recorded in books. Christopher Hedges, Christopher Hedges, who was a Hitchens opponent, like in every way, actually, is kind of another one, but he's even fading. And what they're being replaced with, there are some, like I said, there's some good feminist writers. Mm-hmm. And they are good. I mean, I'm not actually bashing them at all. But when they touch on anything that isn't feminism, they actually do sort of come down on standard democratic line. And a lot of the black activist writers who aren't part of like Black Lives Matter or something do too. There are exceptions. Adolph Reed, but Adolph Reed is of Hitchens' generation. Right. Ta-Nehisi Coates, kind of, but then like he gets crap from Cornel West for not attacking Obama enough, even though it really wasn't relevant to his point, to be fair to Ta-Nehisi Coates. But that's really it. And
it's like the end. There's a certain demarcation between the older intellectual generalists who really could give you a run for your money on a number of topics versus people who, I got my one specialty, I will do my nuance there. But, like to your point, if it's outside that, it's either too simplistic, maybe by virtue of they don't really think about it and they're just going to write down something simple, or they're just, towing a line to make things a little bit easier for them. That is a loss. I mean, it's a huge loss. I mean, I don't like specialization in this front. I'd prefer generalization. I understand why specialization leads you to things, but generally specialists on that vein should be, in my mind, academics. Journalists should be a little bit wider ranging, especially if you consider yourself to be someone who exercises literary talent, because literary talent is a talent for communication and to some degree thinking, which should not be bound to one topic.
Well, but think about the difference in when Hitchens was writing. Hitchens was an opinion journalist and a journalist.
Right, that's right.
Those almost don't exist anymore. Let's be completely frank. I mean, again, that book I was mentioning, The Last Intellectuals, talks about this trend as early as the Cold War, because during the Cold War, suburbanization sort of broke up, and gentrification sort of broke up the old cheap intellectual hubs where you could be a sort of smart writer and study around and talk to a bunch of people, but you didn't have to make tons of money to do it. The other thing that broke it up was the expansion of the university, and that being seen as a way to stably make money for a lot of intellectuals. What's happening now is fascinating because the university is actually losing its grip and power too. So there's a lot of people who are coming out of what is essentially MFA culture and getting jobs now, and writing for Salon or Slate or even, maybe the New York Times. But without clear political patronage, they don't really have a lot to hang their head on, and they're not. They usually are subjects of literary studies plus some other specialized studies, like say women's studies or minority studies or disability studies or something. So they have a broad-based education, but only in one area. I know that sounds weird, but it's not like being a scientific specialist. It's different than that.
You're right, yeah. It's a topic of intellectual thought, not necessarily, like you said, it's not just like I know how to, I do titrations on chemicals and that's all I do. I get that, but I think you're right. There is some degree of that. But to me, like, I'll be provocative and you can tell me if I'm completely out of lunch on this. To me, that's undermining the very foundations of true, I'll sound like an idealist now, like true camaraderie and international kind of thinking. I mean, if you're going to say my focus is on this particular gender study, particularly if that gender happens to be people of a certain, minority ethnicity or whatever you want to go, sexual, preferences, doesn't matter. We have our specialties. That's what I focus on. The other stuff, no.
Yeah, I don't want to get into this too much because, one, we're two white dudes.
Yeah.
Marginally white dudes, anyway. And two, like, I'm going to be accused of holding beliefs I don't have, but I'm going to just go ahead and say one thing, is that that specialization and diversification is often filed under the label of intersectionality. But what I've actually seen, and intersectionality is supposed to actually, expand understanding, so we're talking about class and race and gender and the intersection between all of them. And that's great, right? But in practice, that's not what I see. I see, like, competitions to shut things out. And Hitchens would have opposed that. Now, to be fair to a lot of people who criticize Hitchens would occasionally say pretty inflammatory shit about stuff like that.
Yep.
And some of which was really problematic. I think he said something about female writers that I don't remember the exact wording, but that he legitimately and properly got shit for.
Well, there was the article about how women aren't funny.
Yeah.
And, that was... It was meant to be provocative, and it's probably... There's something, I think, in there to argue against it beyond what people tend to argue against it. His point was that women don't need to be funny because they don't need humor to help them get laid, whereas men do. And his follow-up response to that is, like, if you point to me to a woman who is funny, she is adopting male characteristics. She's either being Jewish, she's adopting Jewish humor, which in Hitchens' mind was male, or she's adopting sort of like something like a lesbian style humor, which is, again, in his mind, he thought was more male humor. There's a lot there to unpack, to put it mildly. But then he was adamant on that. I think, I talk about what we do for money. I have a feeling that was an article he largely took as an assignment from Graydon Carter, because Graydon Carter, publisher of Vanity Fair, where that article appeared, knew that it would raise ire, figured that Christopher would be more than willing to comply. He did, and it got the reaction it wanted. It was, in some regards, pre-clickbait.
Right. Well, he kind of was that. But he was hate clickbait. It's the kind of clickbait that you clicked on because you wanted to see what kind of. I shouldn't say that, but towards the end of his life, I felt like if you were to go do a survey of, like, between the transition of LiveJournal and Facebook, and saw what people were saying about him. And I would put that between 2006 and 2008, right? He went from being somebody that people took seriously but disagreed with in the war to being someone who people just sort of, except for his hardcore fans in the humanist community, who forgave pretty much everything he said no matter what. But even that broke down because those attitudes in the secular humanist community, they were nowhere near as consistent as people thought either. And, for example, Dawkins is, much more provincially British than people realize, and and also much more provincially Anglican sexist than people realize, and stuff like that. And that's sort of falling apart now too. And so, like, after Hitchens' death, what was interesting to me is, like, the quote unquote humanist community and skeptic community sort of fell apart, and partially from its own success, because one of the things that we need to point out is the secularization of the United States is largely over. I mean, it's happened. I know people don't feel that way. But even, for example, look at the Republican Party now, and again, I'm going to get into dangerous territory, but I'm just going to go ahead and say this. Trump does not have a single hint of him of a religious candidacy.
I would agree, yes.
And so I think it's pretty much over and done with.
Well, yeah, as a central motivator for the voters to arrive, yes, I completely. I mean, if it really were as central as people thought, I mean, Rick Santorum and then some of the other guys would be at the forefront. They're not.
And Ted Cruz would be, it might be central in like some podunk county in, I don't know, Dakota, and the Dakotas are in Alabama, but in the main, it's a done battle. I'm not saying that people aren't still religious. 75% of the population still is, and a good 60, maybe 60 to 70% of that is Christian, but 25% of the population just doesn't give a crap anymore.
It's interesting, though, that how you think about that secularization and what it means. It's funny because I would argue, anybody would argue that Christopher Hitchens would be the ultimate secularist in many ways, given his positions. But the more you think about where he was coming at from his atheism or anti-theism, as he would prefer, and you really unpack the way he's thinking, the fact that he has these particularly strong moral views on things, I would say as a thinker and as a writer, he's probably a lot closer to people who are religious in a sort of broader sense of that term than they would perhaps give credit to. In other words, what I'm saying is Hitchens isn't a secularist in the sense of, I'm here to just feed my goals as a consumer of X, Y, or Z. He does have, a moral core to him, which he would argue was just innate in the human condition. There is a kind of, he would kill me if he ever heard that, and a religious type of thinking, or type of thinking that a religious-minded person would recognize, and that to me is an interesting discussion to have. But and why he's a lot more interesting and complex than, as I said, people tend to give him credit on this topic. But I feel that is a loss. I think you're right. The true secularization of the United States, and why Trump is your leading Republican candidate versus not, it is closer to that kind of dynamic. There's a kind of, I'm sounding like an old-fashioned religious commentator, and I'm perhaps going to be embarrassed for that, so I'll just stop.
It's fascinating, man. I mean, it's interesting to me because what happens, as I said before, it's not that people become secular humanists because they believe in, the Enlightenment or rationality. It's exactly as you say. They become secular humanists because, there's not much else to care about. And, that does sound like an old-fashioned religious commentary. It's one that I think is actually borne out by sociological studies.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that if, you look up knowledge of science, for example, there's no difference between knowledge of science between religious and non-religious. There's actually just a difference in belief in it. And it's remarkably low amongst both, including, diehard atheists.
I mean, and again, I think calling ourselves, every time we do this, I think back to why our name as former people is apt. I mean, we always seem to come to this conclusion, which I is both interesting and fascinating and sad in a way, is that everybody we kind of bring up when we talk about them, especially if they've passed on, we reach this conclusion where some core element about them that really helped push them through and define them, or reach achieve some level of success in our minds, or what have you, is gone, or is moving away, or is disappearing a bit. And I think Christopher is again a prime example of that. I know it is interesting to see, though, in the aftermath of various things happening, like trigger warnings on campus, or the Charlie Hebdo shootings, or go down the list of any event. So many people say, "Oh, I wish, what Christopher had to say or Christopher was still around, so I could hear what he had to say. I think you could probably guess what he had to say, but agree, there is a longing for an itch that is no longer there. Partly it's because he's dead, but also partly because that the impetus to scratch that itch from someone else also doesn't exist. And
except for like hardcore libertarians, yeah.
Right.
I mean, frankly, the last 3 years have been interesting, and that a lot of people I knew who hated Christopher Hitchens, and wrote polemics against him even, particularly on the war, had to admit that some of what he said about the less insufficient commitment to like free speech or discourse or whatever would they've had to say that they were right.
The attitude to the American Revolution was actually the one thing on which the left never made up its mind, strangely enough. I think because they thought it had been superseded by more modern ones. Wasn't true of Marx, as a matter of fact. Or Engels. I mean, Marx and Engels wrote that repeatedly that the great country of backwardness and superstition and tyranny and ignorance and barbarism was Russia, and the great country of the future and of equality and liberty was the United States. And they were particularly strong in their defense of Abraham Lincoln, organizing movements in support of the Union in Europe. But there is another strain in the left, which, I mean, eventuates in this nonsense in the Jefferson Elementary School in Berkeley the other day, and also with the writing of Professor Noam Chomsky, who's a very important figure on the American left. Though he calls himself an anarchist, he keeps forgetting that he is one at just the moments it might do him some good. But he is, at any rate, of major influence on the American left. And I realized a few years ago that there was a difference between him, Professor Chomsky, I mean, and myself. Which he did not finally think that the United States of America was a good idea. He thought it had been sort of all genocide since Columbus, basically. I mean, that's not simplifying his opinion by very much.
One of the more interesting comments on Charlie Hebdo crime was by a noted civil rights lawyer, noted for his vigorous defense of freedom of expression, Floyd Abrams. He sharply condemned the editors of the New York Times because they didn't publish the Charlie Hebdo cartoons ridiculing Muhammad that elicited the terrorist assault. And that, he said, if they had done so, it would have properly served the cause of free expression in the immediate wake of the most threatening assault on journalism in living memory. He's actually right. The Charlie Hebdo attack was the most threatening assault on journalism in living memory. That's actually a comment on living memory and on us. Living memory is a category that is very carefully crafted, that we craft very carefully to include their crimes against us and to exclude scrupulously our crimes against them, comparable crimes, often worse crimes. These are not crimes. They're noble defense of the highest values. Maybe sometimes they're inadvertently flawed, like when, unfortunately, civilian casualties were high but not disproportionate. Well, all of this is a special case of a much more general doctrine, which is observed with really impressive dedication and consistency, namely, the more we can blame some crime on some enemy, the greater the outrage. The more we are responsible for it, and therefore incidentally can do something about it to end it, the less the concern, sometimes tending to oblivion or even denial.
And as I said about the Berkeley motion to change the name of the school to Sequoia, in a way it doesn't make any difference. You know, it's a radical attitude, but it's not a radical position because it doesn't commit you to anything, it doesn't mean anything, it doesn't represent anything. Actually, there are times when it can have significance. If you basically think the United States is a bad idea,
then you may feel a sneaking sympathy for others who feel the same, such as, for example, theocratic nihilists, who believe it's a Crusader Jewish racket. And of course it's very important that people make up their minds about this now and stop fooling around about it.
You've got a lot on there that I want to get into. It's like even if you admit that Christopher was wrong, in his defense of his position, he brought out things which they have subsequently agreed was correct, criticisms of them. You know, my favorite example of this, our friend Doug. I had this discussion with him. Doug may or may not like the fact that I'm going to share this. Doug says to me, you know what? At the time, he was really aggressive against Hitchens. He didn't like him. But then in rereading Hitchens, he says, you know what? I realized that the problem with Hitchens is not that I was more or less articulate against the war. It's that I was focused on wanting to go to heaven, and he wouldn't let me. In other words, he thought that if he had held certain beliefs and, you know, was against certain things, he was following the edicts of a mentality which would allow him to be a more, you know, morally righteous person or what have you. And he realized that no, to do so meant that you were not, in fact, as quote unquote pure as you thought you were. That's a big admission for someone to make. And I think a lot of people have made that admission, whether or not they made it publicly. I think that's a good thing.
More now too, though. I mean, conversely, I mean, I think his reputation amongst, say, like millennials is just going to be really bad. It's just, maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong.
I mean, I certainly do too. But you know what my generation thinks has never have never been lockstep with them. So whether they do or not, you know, I'm only interested to the effect to which he becomes something that can be read for future generations. I would advise people to consider what is missing when you can't do that.
And then at one point, I think this is not on camera, I said, if I could convert everyone in the world, not convert, if I could convince to be a non-believer, then I'd really done brilliantly, and there was only one left, one more, and then it'd be done. And there'd be no more religion in the world, no more deists. I wouldn't do it. And Dawkins said, what do you mean you wouldn't do it? And I said, I don't quite know why I wouldn't do it. And it's not just because there would be nothing left to argue with and no one left to argue with. It's not just that, though there would be that. Somehow, if I could drive it out of the world, I wouldn't. And the incredulity with which he looked at me stays with me still.
Thank you.